afternoon on the occasion of the 11th lectures to remember the Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. It is fitting that these lectures are to be held here, an institution that was the brainchild of Kwame Nkrumah in his very early years as a patriot of this country and a lover of this continent. It is fitting that these lectures were instituted in his memory 2 years after his death. And it is fitting that this country now knows that Kwame Nkrumah was an asset not only for the country but for the continent. Several years ago, when Africans throughout the world were asked to name the greatest African who ever lived in the 20th century, the vote identified the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah as that person. Today, therefore, having been given the privilege of giving a lecture in his memory, I've decided to commence this series with the very area in which he excelled. You will remember in 1957, when Ghana attained her political independence, Kwame Nkrumah was as clear as he was passionate. The independence of Ghana was but a beginning of the independence of Africa. In those early days, the bulk of Africa was under colonial rule, save for Ethiopia and Liberia. And it was very clear to him that Ghana's attainment of independence was but a beginning of a process that would take great effort. On that day, he recognized that the very first task that Africans had to grapple with was to regain their independence. His words have often been rendered in much more memorable form, not in the words that he himself spoke, but it has been said of him that he said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and the rest shall be given unto you." And indeed, Ghana did seek and obtain the political kingdom. And when he stood in Accra, Ghana, he not only recognized that Ghanaians had been free, but he recognized that the project of liberating Africa was just beginning. He recognized then that going forward it would not be an easy task. He recognized at that time that the Portuguese were alive and well in Africa, controlling Mozambique, Angola, and Cape Verde. And he was conscious that his compatriots were fighting to liberate their countries. He therefore reminded those who were present on that day in Accra that going forward, that battle had to be finished. He recognized that the French were alive and well. They were present in Senegal. They were present in Guinea. They were present in Mali, Mauritania, Togo, Niger, Gabon, and many other areas. And he recognized that the French had to be removed and that Africans had to regain their independence. He recognized that the British were present in many African countries. They had been present in Ghana. They were present in the Gambia, in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, Rhodesia then, and that they had to be removed. He was also alive to the fact that South Africa and Southwest Africa, now Namibia, was under the yoke of apartheid South Africa. Even in those early days, Kwame Nkrumah was so clear that the process of regaining African independence was also a process of exorcising the ghosts of disunity in Africa. And that is why in his mind, it was important that independence did not just mean the attainment of a new flag and a new national anthem. It meant much more. 1 year after Ghana attained independence, on the 15th day of April 1958 to be exact, there was a meeting of the then 8 independent African countries, at which he reminded those who were present that going forward it was important that Africa recognize the need for total liberation of Africa. Even in those early days, Kwame Nkrumah was under no illusion. He was under no illusion that the imperialist project was alive and well. And he exhorted those who were present in that assembly in Casablanca in Morocco that if Africa was to preserve her newly acquired independence, Africa had to look at the world differently. You will remember jointly with me that those were the years of the Cold War. Those were the years when the world was divided between the East and the West. And that gave meaning to Kwame Nkrumah's exhortation of the leaders then. Thou shalt look neither east nor west, thou shalt look forward. He exhorted African leaders on that day. Once again, in those very early years, he was clear that our politics had to be a politics of total liberation. And it has never been lost on me that even in those early years, there was no shortage of effort on the part of Kwame Nkrumah to bring unity and political vision to Africa. You will remember, even when there were only very few countries, he was present in Conakry in Guinea. He was present with Ahmed Sékou Touré then. He was in Mali with Modibo Keïta. He was with Patrice Emery Lumumba in the Congo to forge a united Africa. But this was never going to be easy. And as if Kwame Nkrumah was a prophet of sorts, no sooner had African countries started attaining political independence than the intrigues of the erstwhile colonial masters started rearing their ugly heads. It started so very early in 1960 in your very neighborhood here in Togo. The same year that Togo regained her independence from her colonizers in France is the very same year that their leader, Sylvanus Olympio, was removed from power. And if one went a little to the east, only 210 days after Congo had attained her independence, Patrice Emery Lumumba was not only removed from power, but was also assassinated. In other words, the sun was setting at noon. And Kwame Nkrumah's fears were coming true. And that is why he moved with jet-like speed to begin to tell African leaders of the day that something had to be done. Because you will remember in the 1960s, that was the period when most countries started attaining their political independence. In 1960s, we had the Nigerians regain their independence. The Senegalese regained their independence, as did the Cote d'Ivoirians. Central African Republic, Kenya, Uganda, and many other leaders and countries regained their independence. So that when the leaders met in the month of May in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1963, Kwame Nkrumah was already very clear that the only way in which Africans could immunize themselves from the shenanigans of the erstwhile political masters was to unite. Those of you who are alive then, and those of you who have been made alive courtesy of history will remember the words of Kwame Nkrumah in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. What amazes me at that time was the clarity with which he saw the issues of the day. What amazes me was the passion with which he identified the problems and the exactness with which he identified the issues which have continued to bedevil Africa today. Many leaders spoke on that day before Kwame Nkrumah spoke. The first leader to speak was, of course, the host of the African leaders, Ethiopia's Haile Selassie. And as if all of them had read Kwame Nkrumah's mind, Haile Selassie was clear in telling the 32 African leaders who are present on that day, not in so many words, but in effect he told them, we Africans have to unite and have to forge our own political agenda in order to ensure that our peoples are not only united, but we have the kind of politics that will give us a pride of place amongst the community of nations in the world. And Haile Selassie set the tone. 32 African leaders spoke, and each one of them was clear that the area which we had to focus on was in the arena of politics and the kind of politics that we had to engage in order to ensure that the continent was a continent that was free indeed. I remember only a few of those speeches. I remember that even those who later became hyenas as they grew into leadership were so clear in those early days that their voices were at once Solomonic and angelic. I remember the words of the then leader of Central African Republic, David Dacko. He said, we are assembled here today as Africans, my little country called the Central African Republic. What would it be without unity? If the colonizers wanted to take it, they would take it away. And the only way in which we can ensure that it's not taken away is through having a political union in Africa. Even David Dacko was clear in those early days. And as if there was a competition for clarity, Ahmadou Ahidjo of Cameroon was equally clear. He said, and I quote, I'm happy to be present with you here today. We come here to identify what is our common interest. And I have no doubt in my mind that Africa will only grow if our politics is the kind of politics that will help improving the quality of the lives of our people. But that clarity was not only restricted to Central and West Africa. Even in East Africa, there was clarity of thought. And that clarity was to be found in the words of Tanzania's first Prime Minister and President, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And he said, we come here not to find ourselves. We come here to find a common denominator. And that common denominator is the unity of the African peoples on the basis of the kind of politics that will lead this continent into the right direction. That clarity was amazing. But the man who captured the moment was the Osajefo Kwame Nkrumah. There was a sense in which, when I read and reread Kwame Nkrumah's speech, I am amazed at how far he could see. I am amazed at how clear he was in his vision. There is not a single sector of the African economy, of the African society, or African politics that he did not look at. But in the arena of politics, he was clear in 1963. What amazes me was the sense of urgency on that day. He told the leaders, we must not come out of this arena without unity. He told them that if we do not unite today, I can tell you that the imperialists are not resting. He told them that today we must leave this hall in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, with the United States of Africa. Because if we do not, Africa will not survive the intrigues of the erstwhile imperialists. He reminded the audience that the colonial project and the neo-colonial project was alive and well. He told them that there was a need for unity on that day. He reminded the 32 leaders who were present that they had not gone there for a jamboree, but they had gone there to create an Africa and a united Africa. And he told them, we must unite now, because if we do not unite now, each one of us will get used to our sovereignty and the trappings of power. He told them all of that. As if Kwame Nkrumah had the foresight of a Jewish prophet, all those things have come to pass. Of course, the Organization of African Unity was the product of reluctant leaders who could not see what Kwame was seeing sitting, even when they were standing on 10-foot poles. And there is a sense, therefore, in which one talks about African unity and political reawakening today is because we come from that very clear and rich history. And we ask ourselves what it is that happened, where is it that the rain started beating us? You know, you Ghanaians, in 1966, in your lack of wisdom collectively, you chose to truncate Kwame Nkrumah's presidency. And this guilt you must bear because it's a historical guilt. And when he left, he was in Hanoi, on his way to Hanoi in Vietnam. He was larger than life. The world, the black world, respected him. He was seen as the leader of the black man wherever he was. But he had no shortage of enemies, because men who do good have no shortage of enemies. The only person who, of his contemporary leaders, saw something good and unique in him was Guinea's Ahmed Sékou Touré. And you will remember with me that when he came back, it was in Conakry in Guinea that he was to settle until he left for Romania. And in his wisdom, Ahmed Sékou Touré made him the co-president. In fact, Ahmed Sékou Touré wanted him to be the president. It is he who said, no, it cannot happen, and he became the co-president. Why is this history necessary? Because at that time, Ghana was able, the leaders of the day were able to demonize Kwame Nkrumah. His legacy was almost obliterated. The statues that had been erected in his honor were brought down. So true that a prophet has no honor in his own home. But in 1972, he was taken upstairs. And when the Ghanaians and Africans started reading some of his works, they were able to realize that a great man had lived in their land. Kwame Nkrumah's memory was restored, and lo and behold, we celebrate a great Ghanaian, a great African. And the reason why we celebrate the Osage for Kwame Nkrumah is because something happened in Africa, and something continues to happen in Africa, which has not allowed Africa to realize our potential. Of course, the coup in Ghana was in 1966. But there had been an earlier coup, as I said, in Togo in 1960. And an even earlier confusion in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1961. But then thereafter, Africa started to move in a totally different direction. My own countryman, the renowned novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, writes in an article, The Politics of Self-Reliance, he says that it would appear that when Africans raised a new flag, the leaders of the day were mentally lynched. They had ears, but they could not hear. They had eyes, but they could not see. And there is a sense in which Ngugi was right, because then coup d'etats started taking place in Africa. In Nigeria, they took away Nnamdi Azikiwe and Abubakar Tafawa Balewa and the southerner of Sokoto. And there is a sense in which Nigeria has never been the same again. There is a sense in which Nigeria has never been the same again. They did not stop there. They went to Algeria and they took away Ahmed Ben Bella. And there is a sense in which Algeria has never been the same again. They did not stop there. They came down to Mali and they took away Modibo Keita. And there is a sense in which Mali has never been the same again. They went to Mauritania and they took others, and much more prominently they took away Mokhtar al-Dada. And Mauritania has never been the same again. They did not stop there. They were not in the business of stopping. They went to Central African Republic. They took away David Dako. They went to Cameroon. They took away Hamadou Ahidjo. They tried to take away Sékou Touré. They failed. But they did not stop there. They went into every country. They went to Congo. They went to Uganda. They went everywhere. And they took away leaders so that Africa was, in a manner of speaking, a pawn in the political chessboard of the erstwhile colonizers. In fact, coup d'etats became so frequent in Africa that those who did not love Africa were hard to say that coups were as frequent as breakfast in Africa. What they did not know was that even breakfast was no longer frequent on African tables, because Africans were no longer engaged in agriculture. Africa was no longer engaged in any meaningful production. All these while the Organization of African Unity, which had been created in 1963 as our savior, was not doing much. African Union, Organization of African Unity, became an annual jamboree of dictators at which they discussed very little. African politics had changed. When the coups left us, it did not stop there. The degeneration of African politics continued apace. Leaders who were surrogates of the colonizers dotted the African continent. And Africa became infamous for leaders whose greatest claim to fame was that they exploited their people and destroyed their countries. Who among you here will forget the exploits of Congo's Mobutu Sese Seko, who at one time was richer than his country, courtesy of his kleptocratic regime? Who among you here will forget the madness of Jean Bedel Bokassa, who crowned himself an emperor? Who among you here can afford the luxury of forgetting such individuals? Who among you will forget the activities of Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia? Who among you can afford that luxury? Who among you here can afford to forget the activities of Hissène Habré in Chad? And the list is as long as your arm. African leaders were engaged in the kind of politics that was destructive of the continent. And African peoples were no longer enjoying their independence. Nkrumah had been clear in his mind that we seek first the political kingdom and the rest will be given unto us. But it would appear that the African leaders had it differently. Seek ye first the political kingdom and poison the political kingdom they must have had. So they poisoned the political kingdom and denied the African population the opportunity of enjoying the economic dividends of independence. They denied the Africans the opportunity of enjoying the dividends of unity. And Africa became not only the land of coups, but also the land of guerrilla fighters. Because these guerrilla fighters now emerged from the bush because Africa had to be liberated one way or the other. We had many of them. In Ethiopia, we had a guerrilla movement that brought up Meles Zenawi. And to his credit, there was some semblance of normalcy and sobriety returned to Ethiopia. In Rwanda, after the genocide in 1994, we had Paul Kagame, and to his credit, there was some semblance of normalcy and sobriety returned to that country. There was the emergence of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni in Uganda, and to his credit, he restored some sobriety and normalcy to that country. We had another one in Liberia, but to his lack of credit, he destroyed that country, Charles Taylor. So that what happened is that African politics was confused. And I want to submit to you that African politics was not only confused, but it had been captured by individuals who had no interest in the safety and long-term health of the continent. So there was a time, because there was never ever a shortage of African leaders who meant well. They meant well, but there was always the hand of the erstwhile colonizer whose agenda was to demonstrate that Africans could not lead themselves. But even in those dark moments, there were great African leaders whose clarity of mind and clarity of vision was always the saving grace. It is not that they did not make mistakes. They made many mistakes, but they were honest mistakes. Who can forget Tanzania's Julius Kambarage Nyerere at that time? Who can forget at that time Zambia's Kenneth David Kaunda? Who can forget them? Who can forget at that time Leopold Sedar Senghor of Senegal? Who can forget at that time Côte d'Ivoire's Félix Houphouët-Boigny? Who can forget that there were leaders who may have been making mistakes, including the introduction of one-party state as a possible antidote to the African problem, but they meant well. But the body of Africa was cancerous. And no amount of political chemotherapy was going to cure this cancer. The cancer had spread too deep. And that is why, therefore, today, I have said that there is need for the reawakening of African politics. Because what is happening in Africa today, perhaps if we took a mental survey of Africa, you will be able to agree with me that this particular argument is both timely and legitimate. Afford me a little luxury, if only to run across Africa, to identify for ourselves what is wrong with Africa today, and why our politics need to enjoy some newly introduced political hygiene. Look at Africa today. Look at Gabon. They have just been through an election, and they do not agree as to who has won and who has lost. In Africa, everybody wins the election. Look at Gabon. I want you to look at Zambia. They do not know who has lost and who has won. In Africa, nobody loses an election. The Zambians are not at ease. And you can go to many countries. You can go to Uganda in the recent past, Kenya in the recent past. We as Africans have a problem. You know, I was telling a friend of mine that Africa has a problem with counting votes. In other parts of the world, they can have voters in 50 million, in hundreds of millions, but in Africa, our voters never get past 10 million. But for some reason, when we are called upon to count our votes, we never can count the votes. This is an African disease, the inability to count votes. And in my view and in my submission, that inability and that inadequacy of Africa to count the votes is one of the problems why Africa must reorient and must reawaken in our politics. It is not lost on me that you Ghanaians will be going to the polls sometimes in the month of December. I pray and hope that you will be able to count your votes. But my fear is that this African disease is also present in Ghana. And there is every danger that you will be unable to count your votes. But I pray I'm wrong. So when you look at Africa today, and sometimes we don't talk about it as openly and as passionately and as painfully as we should speak about it, because we do not know and appreciate that Africa remains, in the words of a Westerner who said that Africa remains a scar on the conscience of humanity. We may think that that is not politically correct, but it is the truth as I speak to you. Today, if we continue with our survey of Africa, we'll have occasion during the other lectures to talk about the economy and unity, but let us focus on the politics of it. Look at Mozambique today. Attained our independence from the Portuguese as I speak to you now. It is not to be found in the headlines of many African newspapers, but there is a contestation in Mozambique between Frelimo and Renamo. The country is not at ease, yet they held an election. As I speak to you today, the Zambians are not at ease. They may have sworn their president on Tuesday of last week, but the opposition are now taking the matter, as they say, to the United Nations. We are exporting our problems. Africa cannot solve our problems. If you look at Angola, they are in a state that the Portuguese describe as non guerra, non paz, no war and no peace. It is deceptive calm. You look at Equatorial Guinea, their politics is the kind of politics that does not allow people to express themselves. And as if Equatorial Guinea was not enough, you go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, the richest resource country in the world, yet one of the poorest countries in the world. They cannot hold an election. They say they have no money. You go to Burundi, it is the same thing. You go to Eritrea, Eritrea is not at ease. You go to Somalia, it is not at ease. You go to Central African Republic, you go to Burkina Faso, they expelled their president a few months ago. You go to Niger, go to Mali, they are killing one another as recently as yesterday. Go to Mauritania, go to Sierra Leone, they are not at ease. Go to the Gambia. There is a sense in which Africa needs to conduct her affairs differently. Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia is right. Africa is not poor. Africa is merely poorly managed. And that is why we must ask ourselves, what is wrong with us? Writing in 1983, the famed Ghanaian writer Chinua Achebe writes of his own country, and he could well have been writing about Africa. He says the trouble with Africa is simply and squarely a problem of leadership. And I dare add, there is also a problem of followership. Africans elect the leaders that they deserve. A South African writer called Greg Mills, in a book called Why Africa is Poor and What They Can Do About It, says that what amazes him, that despite the talk of democratization in Africa, it would appear that Africans are in the habit of making wrong choices 10 out of 10 times. When they are given the vote to vote, they are in the habit of electing thieves. And once they have elected the thieves, they expect the thieves to behave like angels. He says he does not understand the African electorate. I too do not understand the African electorate. And that is why, therefore, going forward, we Africans must ask ourselves a very critical question in the political arena. Because if we don't get it right in politics, we will not get right in economics. History has demonstrated times without number that until and unless you get your politics right, you will never get it right in your economics. I remember not so long ago, there was a country which you must remember with me, and the country is still there, although I refer to it in the past tense. There was a country called the Philippines. It was led by a man called Ferdinand Marcos, who had a wife called Imelda Marcos, who had many shoes. He presided over that country like a colossus. The country could not breathe, but the people praised him nevertheless. Then he lost power, and there came a lady who was the president of that country called Corazon Aquino. And Corazon Aquino said this, that experience and history has taught me one thing, that the thing called democracy, which we say in remembrance of Abraham Lincoln, is the government for the people and by the people, is a good thing. But when the people do not know what they want, the government they create is nothing but a confederacy of fools. I want to submit to us that if Africa is to liberate ourselves from the kind of politics that has held Africa down, Africa must go back to the words of the Osage for Kwame Nkrumah. You know, when you look at Africa, it was almost 50 years ago. In fact, more than 50 years ago, 53 years to be exact, in 1963 when the OAU was founded. We thought that the OAU was the problem, and we said we started moving in the direction that had been prescribed to us by Kwame Nkrumah. So that in the year 2002, we created another body called the African Union. The African Union was designed to be a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more thoroughgoing than the OAU. Several years after the African Union, Africa is no better. Occasionally, our former colonizers want to make us feel good, and they tell us things that we want to hear, so that every other year we have things that are called indices of democracy. And in these indices of democracy, they are hard to say that Africa is now democratizing, that African countries now hold elections frequently. Says Kenya held an election, Uganda held an election, Tanzania held an election, Ghana since 1979 has been holding an election. Every country has been holding election. Elections are the new thing in town. And we are therefore satisfied that frequent periodic elections are the solution to African problems. Every other year, Africans are confronted with candidates, and these candidates have also mastered the art. Periodically, they present to you their agenda of governance, and they remind you of little things that they may have done. That happens in Ghana, it happens everywhere in Africa, but the African condition remains the way it was 53 years ago. In real terms, those of you who are here may be a little better than your cousins in rural Africa, but in real terms, you are no better. In real terms, there is a sense in which your cousins in rural Africa don't have to grapple with rents that are paid 2 years in advance in Accra, in Cape Coast. They don't have to grapple with importing tea and other things from the United Kingdom. They don't have to ally themselves with the political class in order to realize their dreams. There is a sense in which they are immunized from that. Yet there is a sense in which we cannot run away from politics and its impact on the quality of our lives. And that is why we must ask ourselves going forward, what it is or what is it that we must do in order to be politically awake? And that brings me to what I consider to be the major African problem, and is something that we are very uncomfortable about. You know, in our unguarded moments, we Africans, in our unguarded moments, we behave as if we are inferior to the white person. In our unguarded moments. In fact, even in our guarded moments, we sometimes do so. And that is why when we have problems which can be solved within the African continent, we are much more ready to seek assistance elsewhere. You know, Samora Moises Machel of Mozambique was addressing his people in Maputo, and he said that he is amazed by the African, and he said at one time I heard some Africans bragging about their colonial masters, that those who were colonized by the British were heard saying, we are different and better than you because we were colonized by the British. They are more civilized, and they are more intelligent, and they presided over an empire over which the sun does not set. Samora said. Then there were those who were colonized by the French said, we are better because the French are cultured. It is the place of fashion and learning, so we are better than you, the Portuguese, who are colonized by the most backward nation in Africa, in Europe. And he concludes by saying that there is no colonization that can be better than the other. Yet there is a sense in which particularly those of us who have had the Western kind of exposure and education, we are the problem in terms of our political orientation. We who have gone to school are the ones who are the greatest danger to Africa. I do not know what it is that we do at our institutions of learning, but there is something that happens in those institutions right from primary school that makes our default mode the mode of thinking that we are children of a lesser God. And that is why, therefore, even when we play our politics, we want to be approved by external powers. I do not know where Ghana is going to print her ballots for the next election, but I suspect they'll be printed in the United Kingdom. Ghana is no different from other countries. Africans have lost faith in themselves. They cannot trust themselves. They will never print ballots in Ghana because we, for some reason, believe that we are thieves and that if we print them, we'll steal them. In Zambia recently, they printed their ballots. In Dubai, in Kenya, we printed our ballots. In the United Kingdom, all the former French colonies will have them printed in Paris. Then you wonder why our politics is controlled by external factors. When African politicians have been engaged in an election, the very first congratulatory word that they expect, if they were colonized by the British, they are waiting very eagerly whether the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will ring them. And once they receive that call, then they will know that we have been approved and we are now good to go. There is need for reawakening in the manner in which we do things. In fact, there is a sense in which if we do not go back to what Kwame said in 1963, the tragedy is that Kwame Nkrumah could see this in 1963. He could see it. And that is why he was saying, let us unite now. Because it is only in unity. I remember in 1963 when he's talking about political unity, he's saying, I am urging all of you who are present here today, let us come out of this hall with a united Africa, with one army, with a one command unit, with one common currency, because it is only then that we are going to immunize ourselves from the shenanigans of our colonizers. Of course, you ended up with your little sovereignties, and today your politics are the subject of manipulation by European powers. If you had accepted Kwame Nkrumah's view, he was clear at that time that you would have one passport. Today, I moved 3 hours to Togo. I have a Togolese passport printed in France, written in French, asking you about immigration and yellow fever certificate, and asking you to look at a gadget in your eyes whether you have Ebola. And yet the pastoralists across the border never looked at those things and never required any passport. Nkrumah could see this, and all this is courtesy of bad politics. You go between Senegal and Gambia, they are quarreling about the borders and the boundaries. And when you cross the nation, there are different the same ethnic groups across the border. Africa must, in the nature of things, ask herself, what must we do with our politics? This is the mother question. And why is this question important? It is important because I can tell you, without being a Jewish prophet nor being related to one, that if we do not do anything about our politics, Africa will go nowhere. Today, there are two types of people who look at Africa. They are the Afro-pessimists and Afro-optimists. The Afro-pessimists take the view that Africa is God-forsaken, that Africa will go nowhere, that Africans will perpetually be hewers of wood and drawers of water for other civilizations, that Africa will only be humored by other civilizations. Those are the Afro-pessimists. Then there are those who take the view that Africa is now on the rise, that Africa can realize our potential, that Africa with our 1.1 billion people is capable in the next 50 years of competing with other civilizations. I am myself an Afro-optimist of the guarded kind. I believe that this continent has the capacity to shock the world. I have the conviction that this continent has the capacity to change Africa and to change the world. Has it ever been lost on you that Africa has always been on the rise? Through different historical epochs, Africa has always been on the rise. In the 15th century, when the Portuguese were building the Elmina Castle, Africa was on the rise. But it was on the rise for the Portuguese. Then it rose for the Dutch at the same castle. Then it rose for the English. Then it appeared to rise for the Ghanaians in 1957. It appeared to rise. Then something held her down, and Ghana could never quite soar. And there was an apparent darkness at noon, but I now know it was never a sunset. I knew it was an eclipse. And because it is an eclipse and there's only the clouds that have kind of shielded it, I know the African sun will rise in her splendor. But it will only rise if we begin to do things differently. Today, there are few African countries that give me confidence that if we identify the right things, Africa can rise. And these things are happening in the political arena. When I look at Botswana, that little country which in 1966 was called Bechuanaland, which was given to Seseretse Khama as if it was nothing. The only thing that they were famous for was cattle rearing. They did not think much of Botswana. Then 1 year later, Botswana discovered diamond, and the rest is history. They have demonstrated to the world that with your little resources, you can manage those resources effectively. They have demonstrated that you can have a democracy which is a democracy in name. They have had a culture which recognizes that leadership is not a wrestling match. Leadership is an opportunity to serve, and elections are an opportunity in the democratic marketplace where the people give an opportunity to men and women to govern for a period. So between 1966, without the intervention of a coup d'etat, they have had Seseretse Khama govern them. They have had Ketumile Masire govern them. They have had Festus Mogae govern them. They have had Ian Khama govern them. And is the only country on the continent of Africa ever to have had a budget surplus. It can be done. When I see Botswana, I know that it can be done. But it demonstrates that when you have the right politics and create the right environment, then you can see. And if you visit Botswana today, you are able to see. You don't need any explanation. You know, I've always said when somebody says that they have done something and they have to spend 1 hour explaining what they have done, then they have done nothing. When you have done something, you shut up. The things that you have done speak for themselves. And that is not the only country. The other country is Rwanda. In 1994, never in the history of the world post-1945 did the world witness 100 days of a pogrom where people rose against one another, killing each other. 1 million Rwandese of the Tutsi extraction killed even in churches. Then the leadership of Paul Kagame came, a little country tucked inside the heart of Africa, with no ocean to boast of, to export our goods, a landlocked country, with no natural resources, no tourist attraction except a few gorillas. What they have demonstrated by dint of proper and organized leadership is that when you introduce an environment, there is no shortage of detractors of Paul Kagame and some of the things that he does. But when you look at the history of Rwanda, perhaps there is justification for what he is doing for the moment. That country, you go to Kigali, perhaps the cleanest city in Africa, and you see that when you have men and women who love their country and are clear about where they want to go, then countries can realize their potential. When I see Rwanda, I know that Africa can rise. It is not my design to constipate you with information, but allow me to go to Mauritius. Mauritius is a little island, only famous for sugar cane and tourism. A young country, a leader with a clear vision, Sir Siwu Sagur Ramgulam, some of you will remember him. He looked at the country, recognized that we had no resource, and he said, my only resource is human resource. My only resource is sugar cane. So what do? I add value to my sugar cane, make my human resource good resource, and lo and behold, the second country in Africa ever to have had a budget surplus. It can be done. In other words, Africa has demonstrated that as long as you have hygiene in your politics, as long as your political radar points in the right direction, then you can achieve. So there are many other African countries which are reading from the wrong scripts. Those ones can be pulled away from the wrong script and be told the script you have is the wrong one. And he served for 10 years, and during the first 10 years, Zimbabwe did well. Yet history has demonstrated that when you are a good dancer, you must leave the stage. Scarcity adds value. That is what Robert Mugabe did not recognize. Today, Robert Mugabe has presided over a country, the only country in the world, which has no currency. The Zimbabweans sometimes use the pula of Botswana, sometimes they use the yuan of China, sometimes they use the rand of South Africa, sometimes they use the American dollar. And yet Robert Gabriel Mugabe refuses to go. I'm citing Robert Mugabe and Zimbabwe because if there was a course on how not to be a leader in a country, Robert Mugabe is a classical example of how not to lead and how to destroy Africa. But that will never be said to Robert Mugabe at a meeting of the African Union. They'll never tell him that. Because at that meeting we are too nice to each other, and we have been too nice to each other in Africa for too long, with the consequence that we are now paying the price. So going forward, what must we do? Having recognized that leadership is our problem, we must define for ourselves who is a leader. Those of you who are present here, some of you may be in positions of leadership. Some of you may be aspiring to positions of leadership in the political arena. But the question is, why do you want to lead? In Africa, the shortest route to ill-gotten wealth is political leadership. If you want to get wealth without working for it at all, join African politics. That is the truth everywhere in Africa except for very few places. The only place that stands out now in that regard is Tanzania with President John Pombe Magufuli. The rest in Africa, I do not know. Excuse me, I'm a visitor. But when I was a student, I was told that in our tradition we had this thing called hunters and gatherers. That instinct is still alive and well in our political leaders. They hunt and gather buildings and cars and money. And that is why African leadership does not attract our best men and women. And African electorate also responds to money. I do not know whether it happens here in Africa, in Ghana. The African electorate also expects to be bribed so that they can vote. And until the day we are able to exercise the ghost of ethnicity, among other things, and the ghost of corruption in Africa, Africa will never get good leaders.